investing, regulators are getting more interested in exactly, well, they've been interested for a while, but this question of how you measure it. What do regulators need to be looking at most at the moment? What's the most live question?
Right. Well, so I was commissioner of the Securities and Exchange Commission for 6 years, from 2002 to 2008. And so basically, in the United States at least, our securities laws are geared around disclosure. And so you have all sorts of different modes and means and theories of investing. And so the important thing is to have investors know what they're putting money into and whether or not it's true and accurate information that they're getting.
So is disclosure enough, though, when we have these myriad types of products, these myriad meanings for just the very word impact? I mean, do regulators need to start thinking more about trying to categorize what we mean by these different products, as well as just making sure that investors know what they're talking about?
Well, could do. I mean, there's a bit of a discussion now regarding various exchange-traded funds and that sort of thing as to what exactly the product is and how do investors picture that. So the same thing goes with other sorts of areas of investing, and just like with products, whether it's organic or not, or what the Food and Drug Administration deals with, potentially the same thing, especially if it's misleading in the financial area, could be an issue.
Sonia, the IIF has been doing a lot more on sustainable investing in recent years. I mean, do you have a take on this question of how you measure impact? And you must have been doing a lot of work on this.
Well, we are doing a lot of work, encouraged both by kind of increased regulatory and policy oversight, but also from our members who are increasingly pushing us to do more in this area. In terms of measuring impact, I think you've got sort of two questions. One, as you just alluded to, is around the sort of taxonomy piece, right? What exactly are we measuring? We need to have a common understanding, in particular from the perspective of a global firm, right? You can't have one taxonomy in one jurisdiction and another in another, or it really kind of stymies efforts to mainstream this sort of impact investing. So that's one piece. And the other is around the disclosure efforts and the reporting efforts, right? Companies need to have the appropriate data about what they're going to be able to report, and also to understand sort of different scenarios, right? Because some of the risks we're talking about are really long-term in nature, and they could evolve quite differently, depending on what the scenario is. So there's really a lot of work to be done in clarifying what we're reporting and in being able to measure the impact of what we're doing.
Kunal, what are you hearing from clients?
Yeah, I mean, so I think there's probably a couple of lenses through which you could, answer this question. The first thing I would say is that there's obviously widespread interest in this notion, because particularly as asset managers begin to explore their presence here, the question becomes, are you giving up something from the perspective of returns, right? And so are you subjecting yourself to lower returns? And honestly, the evidence is contradictory in that regard at this point, and there's different ways you could look at it. I think what's important, and maybe is not at the forefront of the discussion, is how institutions and individuals themselves think about impact and what it means to them personally. So sometimes my biggest concern is that when we get down to thinking about impact, it becomes a check-the-box activity. And what you do not want ESG to become is a check-the-box activity, because everybody will check the boxes and look really good or bad. I mean, sort of the last session highlighted the risks associated with that.
But I mean, basically, doesn't everything become a check-the-box activity?
It does, but it sort of comes down to how you as an individual, for example, want to manifest your beliefs in a portfolio. So when I think about, ESG 1.0, I think of sort of what was called SRI, socially responsible investing. And socially responsible investing, in my mind, was all about exclusion. You don't want to have certain kinds of companies in a portfolio. And so you kind of just leave them out, and then you kind of go from there. That's harder to really sort of think about it. Today, I think it's more about inclusion, right? And that's what ESG is about. If you're an investor, what matters to you, and how can you build a portfolio that expresses that view? So for instance, we have a partnership with a firm called Sustainalytics, and we've just recently launched carbon ratings. And the notion of carbon ratings isn't to say one firm is good or bad, or polluting more or polluting less, or drilling for oil or not. It is to say that, hey, if you as an investor believe that we're going to transition as an economy to a low carbon economy, and firms that make that transition in anticipation of that world are going to do well, how can that manifest itself in your portfolio? And so we're starting to think about impact in those terms, and it's deeper in my mind as a result than just sort of checking the box.
So I don't know if any of my panelists want to comment on the recent CalPERS board, this pushback really, I guess, quite a strong pushback to the idea that we can have impact and not impact on the returns.
Right. Well, so I wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal back in October regarding this,
so just event. For a brief summary for anyone who isn't following CalPERS day by day.
So CalPERS is the public employees pension fund in California, and most states have analogs to that, but CalPERS is probably one of the larger ones, largest perhaps. Yeah, but anyway, so there was a head of a policemen's union who ran against the current president or the former president now of CalPERS, and he won the election. But basically he said that this woman's running around the world hobnobbing with UN people and going to cocktail parties and talking about ESG or whatever, and she's not paying attention to the bottom line. I want to retire, I want to have a good pension, and she's not doing what she should be doing. He won, and so that kind of set a shockwave through. And then to top it off, at the end of last year, CalPERS reported a loss, pretty sizable loss, which is unfortunate for an already underfunded state pension fund to a pretty big degree, not so bad maybe as Illinois or New Jersey or Connecticut, but still underfunded, and obviously a pension fund should not be in that kind of situation. So that sort of set the tone, at least for that, and so it could be a harbinger of things to come as people, of course, people are living longer, they're looking to the bottom line. Social Security in the United States will not be there to help them really, so people realize that their pension funds, especially one like CalPERS, which is a defined pension program rather than a contributory one, people realize that all their eggs are in that basket.
I mean, that's a significant pushback for somebody unknown to have managed to do that.
And I think also it gets to the very heart of some of the things we're talking about on this panel. In other words, the measurement of impact and also the definition of returns, right? Because underlying that whole CalPERS controversy is the concept that you have to give up returns in order to invest sustainably. Where in fact, if you look across the spectrum of types of impact investment, there's only a very small piece of it, the philanthropy segment, that is specifically not out to maximize returns. So that's a very common perception that's underlying this CalPERS issue. And then I just mentioned the sort of metrics question, right? If you're comparing returns on, say, an ESG index versus a benchmark mainstream index, you've got measurement issues around the measurement of returns in the ESG piece of it. So the more we know about disclosure, the better data we have for measurement of risks, the more we're going to be able to accurately measure the impact and hence the ultimate returns in sustainable investing.
But one thing we have to watch out for is cooking the books and creating, jokes, or not maybe jokes, but artificial indices that really don't measure anything or are very skewed to an end-oriented sort of goal. And I think we see that in all sorts of industries. I mean, arguably with non-GAAP reporting, the SEC and investors are struggling with that as far as, what does that mean? Because we have, generally accepted accounting principles, and so that's the way it's accepted that, and the SEC demands basically that companies report that way. ESG indices and things like that, how are they put together? What do they measure? How accurate are they? And ultimately, does it mislead investors who are, maybe they're not on the green side of things. Maybe they want to, they're worried about how they're going to pay for their old folks' home or whatever that they have to move into at some point. So investors are not monolithic, shareholders are not. If you have a fund that is geared towards a particular type of investing strategy, then that's great. But again, we have to have metrics around it, to your point, so that people, it's truth in investing, basically, just like truth in lending and other things, so that they know what they're getting and that there's no tears at the end of the day when they don't. So
metrics are important, and we certainly spend a lot of time thinking about them. But I also think sometimes we miss the forest for the trees when we get hyper-focused just on metrics. And so what is one of the biggest mistakes most investors make in retrospect? It's generally that people are too short-term oriented in the way that they think about investing. And when you're short-term oriented, you tend to optimize what you are trying to do in the next year, for example, over what you're trying to do in the next 5, 10 years. And if you're building, for example, a pension fund that has to have longevity in it, it appears to me that as a fiduciary today, if you're thinking about risk to your clients and managing a portfolio for the future, you absolutely cannot discount these factors, because as a fiduciary, you're derelict in your duty if you're not thinking about those types of risks in a portfolio today. So to me, it's central to a long-term approach of investing. And I think sometimes the emotion around all of this is way too short-term focused. And I can't imagine, even today running a company, where 5, 7 years out, you're not thinking about these risks to your company. And you're not going to successfully get to those risks if you're just thinking about what to do over 1 year.
One thing I just want to jump in on too, I agree that as far as long-term investing goes, but it also depends on how you define long-term investing. So a few years ago, I read a British pension scheme. Came out. The head of it came out with about a 6-page document where he talked about essentially, what we have to do. We have to have a view towards long-term, but we can't just think about our beneficiaries. We have to think about their children and their children's children. Well, try telling that to your beneficiary who is looking for, a return, and again needs that income to help him or her, through retirement. So,
I think what was so interesting about the CalPERS story, and it's not just about CalPERS. There was a sort of insurgent response, which is like, ESG is exactly like you said. You're heading off to Davos, and you're hanging around to the UN or whatever, and here's blue-collar person who just wants a retirement, and all that's just wishy-washy. Was there a better fight that could have been fought? And I don't mean the particular campaign. I mean, how do you counter that? This is what you're saying with other people's money. That's the other thing to say about CalPERS. It's other people's money. It's it's an investment style that's being decided about other people's retirements. They don't get to say.
Well, so who's saying this? Like who's
well,
saying
people
this,
voted.
Right?
People voted
I think
for this guy.
if you go back to Sally's earlier session, one of the things that you can take away from that is that there's a traditional view of finance, and that view is not particularly inclusive when you think about, for example, women participating in financial services. And if you look at the data, most women who are slowly, taking over family wealth as you sort of have a turnover in generations, are saying they care about this, and that this is one way that they relate to money and want to get involved. So to me, that's an old school view driven by males who have kind of dominated.
Maybe CalPERS is mostly male pensioners. I don't know.
Yeah, I would say.
Yeah. Well, but again, when you have if you're looking at the bottom line ultimately, which is the thing that a fiduciary has to be concerned of, and especially a pension fund, and with ERISA, the bottom line is absolute, and that's the only way to really measure it, ultimately performance, and whether or not you have your duty of care and duty of loyalty to your investors, which is required by law. If you have any other extraneous type of influence, at least under ERISA, that is verboten, basically. So
don't jump in there.
But I think if you're bringing up ERISA as kind of a definition of what is right and what is the correct way to look at this in terms of a framework, I think you bring up the idea that we're rethinking our whole sort of regulatory and policy framework toward this type of investing, right? Because the rules under ERISA were set up many, many years ago, and they kind of define maybe some of the ESG type factors as you say, sort of extraneous to the bottom line, when in fact, as we're increasingly learning, they're not. Right?
Well,
particularly if you take a much longer term approach.
It's also the case that there's a lot of emotion around the whole thing because everyone focuses on the E in particular and to a certain degree the S. But the G has for a long time been central to every process. So it's nothing new in that regard and has proven to add a lot of value. And so my view is this is sort of a change in the way that I think investors are just kind of coming to think about things. But I hear you that you have to kind of meet your requirements under ERISA, and those are very valuable. But I don't know how you do that and think about building a forward-looking portfolio.
Well, it happens with law. You have to then change the law, and so good luck with that in this environment, right? So, I think portfolio managers have to, unless they want to court lawsuits and other things in the future,
that's fair.
They have to focus on that. But that's
it
not
does
to
get
say
back
that
to the time period question, though, right? Mm-hmm. And I do think ERISA would say that if you're thinking about a 5-year return, for example, that's not unreasonable.
No, again,
right?
it all depends on how you're going about investing, what your mindset is. And so if you have emails around saying, oh yeah, this would be great to do it because of, whatever, that's not focused on a return, then that could be a problem, right? Just from a legal strategy thing. So sorry.
I want to move away from this particular discussion, interesting as it is, though, to talk back about this question of sort of classification. I mean, it's always the death of everything when people say, oh, I don't, let's stop talking about what we're doing and start talking about how we describe it and how we classify it, and are there 17 different buckets or is it 19, and do these things belong together or whatever. But I think people are progressing that way. I think the sorts of things that Morningstar are doing, things the IIF are doing, we are getting a better way to describe and a taxonomy of the ESG space. Is there a risk that we too soon close off innovation by doing this? That if we say, well, what is ESG, and it's these sort of different strands, that there are innovative things that people could be doing that then end up not counting. Are we worried about this yet, or are we not there yet?
So I think you really have two pieces to this question. One is kind of taxonomy related, and one is about sustainable investing terms themselves.
Okay.
The taxonomy, for example, in the European Union that they're working on, very specific taxonomy. This is green, this is not green. We're going to support this, we're going to penalize this with, say, higher capital charges for certain types of, brown investments. The more prescriptive they get, the less innovation in the private sector can sort of blossom on its own, right? So we're encouraging any such kind of policy regulatory oversight to be sort of clear and broad brush in scope rather than getting very granular. So that's one aspect of it. On the sustainable investing terminology, I mean, that is actually huge, right? It's a big concern in the impact investing world that you have so much fragmentation in the market. If you could kind of put things into bigger buckets, I think it would be easier to sort of scale up this type of investment.
I would agree.
Yeah, I think one thing about the government intervention, Europe has never really had an active capital markets compared to the United States. And that's because in the United States, we have allowed innovation. We haven't forced people into little buckets. The banks don't play the role that they do, say, in Germany or other countries like that. And so thus we have a very vibrant venture capital and private equity market, and so in a private securities market, aside from the public markets. And so there's that give and take, which then encourages it. So I think Europe is just going down the wrong road to really try to micromanage the capital markets. I think that's just going to continue their doldrums, basically, of not advancing like others, like we are here in the U.S. Anyone
want to defend Europe, or are we just going to trash them?
I would just say that despite the difficulties with getting capital markets union going and the complications that Brexit presents in that regard, that there is still an intent to build up capital markets in Europe. Big recognition of the importance of that.
Yeah, sure.
But the banking sector does, of course, play a bigger role. But the banking sector can also play a big role in mainstreaming sustainable finance. So.
Well, but in Europe, you have a lot of influences, but it all comes down to the investor. Does the investor want to risk his or her capital putting it into whatever product it is? And in Europe, people have, for a lot of different reasons, not being willing to invest in equities, but the famous Belgian dentist buys debt and the German ones as well. So it's, the European challenge is how do you get people to be able to risk their capital in the market?
Well, it's also the case that a lot of the European capital is invested by sovereigns. And I would just say that I don't have a view on the capital markets per se in Europe, but I will say that their capital flows all around the world. And the decisions they're making around ESG in many instances are driving companies even stateside to change their policies. It's driving asset managers who want to win mandates on behalf of European sovereigns and other firms to change their mandates. And so the impact from Europe is in many ways washing ashore here and elsewhere, and is in many ways the driving force for what's going on in the US. If you go talk to asset managers, they're certainly changing because of demand in the US, but it's also the reality that many of them have large books of business in Europe, and they're responding to what's going on there. So in my mind, it's not just a capital markets view, it's actually a question of how they're choosing to invest their money and how that's...
yeah, I mean, I think people often misunderstand what the EU is, and what it is the world's sole regulatory superpower. with GDPR and so on. That's what you see. You know, other people don't even necessarily agree it's the right approach, but they don't have that much choice but to follow.
I think it's also important to note here that in the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which is a private sector-led initiative, although supported and encouraged by the Financial Stability Board on the regulatory side, this is a private sector effort to sort of improve the metrics that we've been talking about, to improve reporting, to improve disclosure, provide sort of a template for it. And I think it's very important that this process be private sector driven rather than kind of a top-down mandatory approach. So, and that is all.
Yeah, and unfortunately that one though, its association with the Basel Committee I think is problematic. Its funding by Michael Bloomberg is also problematic. So I think, you know, that one does have issues as well. But
I'm going to use the last 5 minutes for questions from the floor. I have 2 hands up here, so can we take both questions together maybe? Some mics can come here. Thank you. Just put your hands up again so she can see who she's going to. Yeah.
Next to each other.
Thank you. So I'll take both questions and then we can jump in on either of them.
Bhakti Merchandani. I work at a think tank called FCLT Global and teach at Columbia. My question is on metrics. So metrics for corporations are pretty good. Metrics for asset managers, they're to some extent not as much on the ESG side and all self-reported. And for asset owners, the metrics really aren't there. What do you think needs to happen? If we start with the theory that asset owners drive the way all of this works, and Kunal, you mentioned that with ESG investing trends, but how can we encourage asset owners to disclose more about their holdings, their portfolios, and how can we encourage them to encourage asset managers to disclose more rather than just kind of develop new products that suit asset owners' goals?
And we'll take the other question too, and then we can respond to both.
Hi, I'm Diana Glassman, and I'm working in this whole area of responsible investing in upstream oil and gas. What does that mean, including metrics, disclosures, and all of that? And my question is for Kunal, really on the financial materiality side and also on the impact side. Are we better off focusing on G in upstream oil and gas than E? And is E, climate, all of that really material?
Right.
And would we be better off not doing all that scenario planning, but really just working on G?
Okay.
I wish I had the answer to your question.
Well, you can have, hold the thought for a minute, and let's just answer this question about getting more disclosure from the asset owners. Is there something we can do here?
Well, as far as the U.S. asset managers go, you know, there is really robust disclosure of portfolios required by the SEC. And even, you know, 13F, which is, you know, if you have more than $100 million in the market, you have to disclose on a, you know, it's like a delayed basis, a quarter or so. So, I mean, there's a very, and you look at the statements of additional information by every mutual fund puts out, it's very robust, detailed type of information, if that's what you're asking. Of course, private equity firms, if they are privately managed and not you know, publicly reporting with SEC, those are a bit more opaque. But anyway, but there is, at least in the United States, with respect to the portfolio, not necessarily as far as, you know, what does ESG mean or sustainability or whatnot, that hasn't been really defined by the government anyway. But
Yeah. I would echo that for Europe. IOPA has a very broad oversight of what pension funds in Europe need to disclose. And also that the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, has a set of kind of parameters for asset managers and asset owners and metrics as well that they're encouraging. So sort of top down and bottom up there.
Yeah, and I would just add to your question that I think as long as it is some type of a regulated entity, such as, like, let's say a mutual fund or an ETF, the disclosure is really pretty good, and that's what's driving our ratings, for example. You know, we look at the underlying holdings, marry the Sustainalytics data to it, and then provide a portfolio level view of things. So I think that data is actually pretty good, especially in the US. It's a little bit hit or miss elsewhere around the world, depending on what disclosure looks like. But I'm not sure if you're seeing a particular area where the disclosure is not good, but that has not been, at least my experience, up to this point. I think the harder thing is to make sure you get the right data from the companies in a consistent format, so you can actually do the company level ratings appropriately and then roll it up.
So now I know you don't want to give, you know, the answer to these, should we forget about E and just focus on G, but is there any comment you'd like to make on this?
The thing I would say, look, there's sort of the external pressure of ESG, and then there's who you are as a firm. And I think it's very difficult to do ESG if it's a check-the-box activity. And the fact that you're here means that within your firm, it's important. And I always say to folks, you have to do something that's going to resonate with your values, because you're going to get people aligned around that and moving around that. I think you have to do the G anyway, as a, if you're a publicly traded company, for example, or even if you're not. I think G is just important from a governance perspective. I think you look at the E and the S from the perspective of what your future looks like and how they sort of measure up there. If they could have a meaningful impact on your future, then I think at a minimum, it probably is worth paying attention to.